My parents' perfect marriage was a business deal. While clearing out my childhood home, I found documents revealing my parents' loving marriage was a cold, contractual agreement with disturbing clauses. I am 45 and teach the past to kids who only care about their future. My mother's death left her house silent and full of things to be sorted. Her final wish was for me to handle everything personally. My father, an architect who worshipped order, had a study I rarely entered. The room was his sanctuary, a place of quiet lines and balanced design. I was looking for his will when I noticed the floorboard beneath his desk. It was slightly raised, a flaw he never would have tolerated. I pried it up with a letter opener and found a flat, sealed compartment. Inside lay a single leather-bound folder with no title on the cover. It felt heavy, important, and completely out of place. I opened it on his vast oak desk, the place where he designed buildings. The first page was a contract between him and my mother, signed on their wedding day. I kept reading, my breath catching in my throat. An entire section detailed the financial terms of their 50-year union. Then a different clause described the mandatory production of an heir. That heir was required to cement the family's business interests. A cold dread washed over me as I realized I was not a son. I was the fulfillment of a contractual clause. I pushed the folder away as if it were burning my hands. My mind raced to build a defense against the words on the page. It had to be a misunderstanding of cold, legal language. My parents were not monsters. They were just very private people. I forced myself to remember my father in the backyard. He spent an entire summer teaching me how to throw a baseball. I remembered the patience in his voice and the pride in his eyes. My mother would read to me for hours when I was sick. She would sit by my bed and gently stroke my forehead. These were not the actions of people fulfilling a business contract. These were memories of real love and genuine affection. I told myself their marriage was just quiet and undemonstrative. They showed their love through actions, not grand romantic gestures. I had built my entire life on the foundation of their stability. I desperately searched through my memories for more proof. I pictured family dinners filled with quiet conversation about my day at school. They always presented a united front to the outside world. This document was a relic from a past that no longer mattered. They grew to love each other even if they started differently. That was the story I decided to believe for a little while. My attempt at self-deception was a fragile thing, easily broken. The quiet house kept pushing me back toward my father's desk. That leather-bound contract held a truth I could no longer ignore. I knew I wouldn't find peace until I had dissected every last word. It was a historian's grim duty to examine the evidence. I sat down and forced myself to read it all, slowly this time. The preamble described the union not as a marriage, but as a strategic alliance. It was designed for the mutual preservation of assets and public standing. My mother's family, the Ashworths, were desperate to escape a financial scandal. My father's name was their solution, a key to social redemption. In return, his architectural ambitions were given life by their vast fortune. An entire schedule detailed the transfer of funds to his new firm. It was the price they paid for his identity. I saw a clause titled Public Presentation Requirements and felt sick. It mandated a minimum of 20 joint appearances at galas and charities. It even specified that holiday photographs must convey an image of familial warmth. I remembered a Christmas photo where my dad's smile never quite reached his eyes. Another subclause dictated the home we lived in. It was chosen to project an image of old money and quiet dignity. This house was not a home. It was a carefully curated stage set. Then I returned to the section about the heir, about me. The contract referred to this child as the legacy asset. A timeline was brutally clear. The asset had to be produced within 5 years. There were even stipulations for my education at specific prestigious schools. My entire life had been plotted out before I was even conceived. Every memory I cherished was now tainted by this cold, hard text. The love I thought I knew was just a series of contractual obligations. My world wasn't just shaken, it was completely and utterly erased. For a full day, I just sat in my father's leather chair. The house was a mausoleum of lies, and I was its only ghost. The shock slowly curdled into a desperate, burning need for answers. I needed another person to see the document I had found. I needed someone to confirm that I was not completely insane. There was only one person left who would know the whole truth. truth. My mother's brother, Richard Ashworth, was the executor of her estate. He was a cold man who moved through the world like it was a boardroom. I always felt like a minor item on his agenda during our brief interactions. I called him and told him I had found some old family legal papers. He agreed to meet me the next day at his downtown office. His office was on the top floor of a glass and steel skyscraper. It was a sterile space that smelled of money and had no personal photographs. I placed the leather folder on his vast mahogany desk between us. He opened it, showing no surprise on his carefully composed face. He scanned the first few pages with a familiar, dismissive impatience. Then he looked up at me as if I were a foolish child. He told me I was being dramatic about a sensible arrangement. He called it a practical solution to a difficult family problem. He said my parents were good people who fulfilled their obligations perfectly. He explained that their generation valued dignity and discretion over messy emotions. He insisted they had provided me with a wonderful, privileged life. He asked what more I could have possibly wanted from them. His words were calm and logical, designed to make my pain seem unreasonable. I started to doubt the validity of my own feelings. Maybe he was right and I was just being naive and ungrateful. I left his office feeling more lost and confused than ever before. My grief felt illegitimate, a selfish response to a pragmatic decision. My uncle's words haunted me as I drove back to the house. I felt ashamed of my own grief, a spoiled child crying over a perfect life. I put the leather folder back in its metal box. I tried to see my parents through Richard's eyes. They were dignified people who had made a practical choice. They had given me everything a person could ever want. For 2 days, I tried to clean the house and pack away memories. But the historian in me could not let the story rest. A single document was not enough to rewrite an entire life. I needed more evidence to either confirm or deny my uncle's version of the truth. I started with the filing cabinets in my father's study. I went through years of tax returns, bank statements, and property deeds. Everything was meticulously organized, a perfect paper trail of a successful life. Then I found a box deep in a closet labeled Personal Correspondence. Inside were hundreds of letters my parents had written to each other. They were sent during my father's frequent business trips. I had always imagined they were love letters he sent back home. With trembling hands, I opened the first one and began to read. The letters were all cold, impersonal, and brutally efficient. They discussed household expenses and the stock market's performance. They talked about my grades and my dental appointments. I was a project whose progress they were tracking with shared diligence. There were no terms of endearment, just polite, formal closings. Then, at the bottom of the box, I found it. It was a draft of a letter from my father to my mother. He accused her of having an affair that risked public embarrassment. He stated this was a clear violation of their partnership agreement. He was not hurt. He was litigious. He formally requested a renegotiation of his management fee for the family assets. My uncle's lies fell apart in the face of this new, damning proof. The anger I felt was cold and sharp, a piece of glass in my heart. My father was an ambitious stranger, and my uncle was a liar, but my mother remained a mystery I now needed to solve. Her betrayal felt different, quieter, and I had to understand it. I left the study and went to her bedroom for the first time. The room was immaculate, a space of quiet elegance and restraint. I searched for something that felt truly hers, not part of the performance. Tucked away on the top shelf of her closet was an old hat box. It was unlocked and filled with several small, leather-bound diaries. Her handwriting was a delicate script, a stark contrast to the contract's harsh type. I started reading the earliest one, dated just before her wedding. She wrote about the unbearable pressure from her family to marry my father. She described her love for another man, someone her parents deemed unsuitable. He was a university student with no money or status. She wrote about their secret meetings and her dreams of a different life. Her family forced her to end the relationship to save their reputation. She described her wedding day not with joy, but with quiet resignation. Her life with my father was a role she had to learn to play. She called their home a beautiful cage where she performed her duties. Then I found the entries from the year I was born. She wrote that her pregnancy was a terrifying contractual obligation, but the moment she held me, something changed inside her forever. She confessed a fierce, secret love for me in those pages. I was the only part of her life that felt real and honest. She called me the loveliest part of a terrible bargain. My anger at her dissolved into a profound, aching sadness. Her life had been a sacrifice, not a simple business transaction. My fight was no longer about my own broken illusions. It was now for her stolen life and her silent, hidden truth. The sadness for my mother hardened into a cold and clear resolve. I was no longer a grieving son lost in a sea of confusion. I was the sole keeper of her story, and I had a duty to it. I carefully placed the diaries back in the hat box. I called my Uncle Richard and told him to come to the house. I instructed him to bring our cousins, who were partners in the family firm. My voice was steady and devoid of the emotion he had mocked before. I told him it was not a request he had the option to refuse. They arrived that evening, wearing expensive suits and expressions of annoyance. I led them to the formal dining room, the stage for so many of our family's performances. I did not offer them a drink or a seat at the table. Instead, I laid out the evidence on the polished mahogany surface. I started with the partnership agreement, then the loveless letters. I added my father's draft about the affair and its financial implications. Finally, I placed my mother's diaries at the very center of it all. I explained what they contained without reading from them directly. I told them her entire life was a prison built to save their name. They did not react with shame or with any kind of remorse. They reacted with cold, reptilian indignation. Richard told me I was dragging our family name through the mud. My cousin said I was disrespecting the memory of my own mother. They called her sacrifice a necessary and dignified act for the family's survival. When my cold silence made it clear I was not persuaded, their strategy shifted. Richard offered me a substantial amount of money to remain silent. He called it a trust to secure my future, but it was just a bribe. They saw my mother's pain as a private issue to be managed. They thought her story had a price tag, just like everything else. I told them to keep their money and get out of my mother's house. The battle lines were now drawn. After they left, a strange and profound calm settled over me. The rage had burned away, leaving behind a cold, hard purpose. My family only understood the language of power and public perception. They had built their world on a carefully constructed public image. I decided in that moment that I would be the one to burn it down. This was no longer about finding peace or getting answers. This was about correcting the historical record for my mother's sake. I spent the next day in a methodical and focused search online. I looked for a journalist who had written about my city's powerful families. I found a series of articles by an investigative reporter named Sarah Jenkins. She had a reputation for being fearless and incredibly thorough. She had even written a critical piece about the Ashworth family's business ethics years ago. She was the perfect person to tell this story. I sent her a short anonymous email from a new account. I told her I had a documented 50-year story about a prominent family. She replied within the hour, her interest clearly piqued by my message. We arranged to meet in a quiet corner of the city's main library. I made careful photocopies of the contract, the letters, and key diary pages. I organized them in a neat folder, a historian presenting his evidence. I laid it all out for her on the table between us. I explained the documents with a detached academic precision. I told her my mother's story without emotion, letting the facts speak for themselves. She listened intently, her expression shifting from curiosity to utter shock. When I was finished, she asked me what I wanted in return. I told her I wanted absolutely no money for this story. My only condition was that she tell the truth about my mother's life. She was not a partner in a deal. She was its primary victim. I left the folder with her and walked out of the library. I had just fired the first shot in a war they didn't even know had begun. The week that followed was the quietest I had ever known. I went about the business of packing up the house. I sorted through objects that now felt like props from a play. Each day I expected a call, a sign, something to break the silence. The journalist, Sarah Jenkins, sent me a single brief email. She confirmed her fact-checkers were verifying the authenticity of all the documents. She told me the process would be meticulous and would take some time. I understood what this meant in practice. She would have to contact my family for an official comment. I did not have to wait very long for the explosion. My phone started ringing with a number I knew was my uncle's office. I ignored the first few calls and let them go to his voicemail. His initial messages were clipped and furious, demanding I call him back. Then the tone of his messages began to shift into outright panic. He started leaving long, rambling threats on my phone. He threatened to sue me into absolute poverty. He said he would use the contract's own non-disclosure clauses against me. He promised to destroy my teaching career and my reputation. The threats all felt surprisingly hollow, like echoes from a distant world. The power his family once held held over me was completely gone. They could not take away a family I never truly had. They could not threaten me with the loss of money I now despised. A few days later, Sarah Jenkins called me directly. She told me everything had been verified and the story was written. She said it was scheduled to run online the very next day. She asked me one last time if I was absolutely sure I wanted to proceed. There was no hesitation in my voice when I answered her. I told her to publish the story and expose every last lie. I ended the call and sat down in my father's empty chair. The quiet house was now holding its breath, waiting for the coming storm. I did not sleep at all that final night. I just watched the sun rise over a city that was about to learn my family's secret. I made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and opened my laptop. I did not have to search for the story. It was the lead headline on the front page of the news site. The title read, "The 50-Year Lie, the Foundation of the Ashworth Fortune." My hands were perfectly steady as I clicked the link and began to read. The article was a masterpiece of cold, journalistic precision. Sarah Jenkins had laid out the facts without melodrama or sensationalism. She quoted key passages from the partnership agreement. She detailed the financial transactions that funded my father's career. She described his letters and his threats of legal action over an affair, and she told my mother's story with a deep and profound empathy. She used the diaries to paint a portrait of a woman trapped by duty. She was a victim of her family's ruthless ambition, not a willing partner. The story did not portray them as monsters, but as something far worse. It showed them as emotionally bankrupt people who valued image over everything. Within an hour, the article was the most read story in the city. I watched the share count climb into the thousands. The comments section was a torrent of shock and public condemnation. The Ashworth name, once a symbol of dignity, was now a synonym for a cold and calculated lie. Late in the morning, the article was updated with a short statement. The Ashworth family had no comment on the private family matter. Their silence was the loudest confession they could possibly have made. I read the entire article one last time, and then I closed the laptop. The one thing they valued above all else was their public name. And I had just turned it to ash. There was no feeling of victory, only a vast and silent emptiness. The war was finally over. The story was a firestorm for about a week. Then, like all news, it faded into the background noise. My life became a landscape of absolute, unending silence. My phone never rang again with my uncle's number. My cousins and their children completely vanished from my life. It was as if I had never existed in their world at all. I was a ghost they had collectively decided to stop seeing. I finished the work of emptying out my childhood home. I packed away books, clothes, and kitchenware into cardboard boxes. I dismantled the life that was built on a foundation of lies. The process felt strangely impersonal, like I was an employee clearing a property. I felt no sadness, no anger, and no lingering sense of loss. There was nothing left inside of me to feel. The movers came and took away all of the furniture. They left the house hollow and echoing with my footsteps. The final object left was a single large family photograph from the mantelpiece. It was from a vacation when I was about 10 years old. My father had his arm around my mother's shoulder. I stood in front of them, smiling broadly at the camera. We looked like the perfect, happy American family. I stood in the empty living room and stared at the image. I was not looking at my parents and my younger self. I was looking at three strangers performing their roles with precision. The man, the woman, and the boy in the picture never really existed. There was no comfort to be found in this final, brutal truth. There was no lesson to be learned from any of this. There was only the silence of an empty house and the cold, hard fact that I was completely and utterly alone. If you enjoyed this video, support it with a like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with your thoughts. Your reaction helps me create new stories.